Minneapolis, Minnesota. A 19-year-old woman walked into Flyte Tyme Studios carrying more emotional baggage than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Janet Jackson had been performing since she was 7 years old, but she had never been allowed to be herself. Every song, every dance move, every public appearance had been choreographed by her father, her brothers, or the machinery of the Jackson entertainment empire. What happened over the next 8 months would transform her from the baby of America's most famous musical family into an independent artist with her own voice, her own vision, and her own uncompromising creative control. But this story begins with suffocation, with the kind of artistic imprisonment that success can create when it comes too early and stays too long. Janet had been thrust into the spotlight as a child, first as an actress on television shows like Good Times and Fame, then as a reluctant recording artist whose debut albums were crafted by A&M Records executives who saw her primarily as Michael Jackson's little sister. Her first 2 albums had been commercial disappointments that felt like musical costumes designed by people who didn't understand who she was or what she wanted to say. The Jackson family dynamic was both a blessing and a curse that followed Janet wherever she went. Joseph Jackson had built an entertainment empire on the backs of his children, turning the family home into a training ground for professional performers who learned to sing and dance before they could properly walk. The success of Michael and the Jackson 5 had created a template that everyone expected Janet to follow, but that template felt like a prison to a young woman who was beginning to understand that she had her own artistic instincts and creative desires. By 1985, Janet was suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations and decisions. Her marriage to James DeBarge had been a disaster, partly orchestrated by family members who saw it as a way to control her personal life while advancing their professional interests. The recording contracts, the song choices, the image decisions, everything about her career was being determined by people who claimed to know what was best for her, but who had never bothered to ask what she wanted for herself. The break came when Janet fired her father as her manager, a decision that sent shockwaves through the Jackson family and the music industry. Joseph Jackson had managed every aspect of his children's careers for decades, and the idea that one of them would reject his guidance was unprecedented. But Janet had reached a breaking point where artistic authenticity mattered more than family harmony, where her need for creative control outweighed her fear of disappointing the people who had shaped her entire life. John McClain, her new manager, understood that Janet needed more than just a new recording contract. She needed creative collaborators who would help her discover her own artistic identity rather than trying to impose someone else's vision on her music. The search for the right producers led to Minneapolis, to a studio called Flyte Tyme, and to 2 former members of Prince's band who understood something crucial about artistic independence and creative control. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis had been kicked out of the Time by Prince for missing shows while working on outside projects, but their exile from Prince's organization had forced them to develop their own distinctive sound. Working out of Flyte Tyme Studios, they had created a production style that blended funk, R&B, and pop in ways that felt both nostalgic and futuristic. More importantly, they had learned how to collaborate with artists as creative equals rather than trying to mold them into predetermined commercial categories. The first meeting between Janet and the Minneapolis producers was electric with possibility. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis didn't see her as Michael Jackson's sister or Joseph Jackson's daughter. They saw her as a 19-year-old woman with untapped creative potential and stories to tell that no one had ever allowed her to share. The conversations that took place during that initial session weren't just about music. They were about identity, independence, and the courage required to risk everything in pursuit of artistic truth. The album that emerged from these collaborations would be called Control, and the title wasn't accidental. Every song on the album was designed to communicate Janet's determination to take charge of her own life, her own career, and her own artistic destiny. The opening track, Control, was a manifesto set to music, a declaration that she was no longer willing to be managed, molded, or manipulated by anyone who didn't respect her creative intelligence and personal autonomy. Working with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis was a revelation for Janet. For the first time in her life, she was being asked for her opinions about arrangements, lyrics, and production choices. The Minneapolis Sound that the producers brought to the project was sophisticated enough to showcase her vocal abilities while maintaining the rhythmic complexity that would appeal to both R&B and pop audiences. But more importantly, the creative process was collaborative in ways that honored her input and encouraged her artistic growth. Nasty became another cornerstone of the album, a song that addressed the street harassment that Janet and countless other women experienced daily, but that was rarely discussed in popular music. The track's aggressive funk groove and confrontational lyrics created a template for how female artists could address social issues while maintaining commercial appeal. This wasn't just a pop song. It was a statement about women's right to move through the world without being objectified or intimidated. The recording sessions at Flyte Tyme Studios became a form of therapy for Janet, a place where she could process years of family pressure and industry manipulation while channeling those experiences into music that felt authentic and empowering. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis created an environment where vulnerability was seen as a strength rather than a weakness, where personal revelation could become the foundation for universally appealing songs. What Have You Done For Me Lately emerged from Janet's frustration with people who had taken credit for her success while offering nothing in return. The song's driving beat and pointed lyrics spoke to anyone who had ever felt used or undervalued in professional or personal relationships. But the track also demonstrated Janet's growing confidence as a vocalist and performer, her ability to deliver emotionally complex messages with both vulnerability and strength. The creative process for Control required Janet to confront aspects of her family relationships that she had never been allowed to address publicly. Songs like Let's Wait a While dealt with her desire to make her own decisions about intimacy and relationships, pushing back against family members and industry executives who had tried to control every aspect of her personal life. This wasn't just artistic expression, it was psychological liberation. Working in Minneapolis also allowed Janet to distance herself physically and emotionally from the Jackson family dynamics that had dominated her life for so long. Flyte Tyme Studios became a sanctuary where she could experiment with different aspects of her personality and artistic identity without worrying about family approval or disapproval. The geographical separation was crucial to her emotional and creative development. When Control was released in February 1986, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics who had dismissed Janet's previous work as lightweight pop suddenly recognized her as a serious artist with something important to say. The album's success wasn't just commercial, though it would eventually sell over 10 million copies worldwide. It was cultural, establishing Janet as an independent voice who could address women's issues, family dynamics, and personal empowerment with a sophistication that transcended typical pop music boundaries. The visual presentation of Control was as revolutionary as the music itself. The album cover showed Janet in stark black and white, looking directly at the camera with an expression of determination and confidence that was completely different from the soft, accommodating image that had defined her earlier career. This wasn't the Jackson family's little sister. This was an artist who demanded to be taken seriously on her own terms. The success of Control transformed Janet from a reluctant member of a famous family into a major artist with her own distinctive identity and creative vision. The album proved that artistic independence wasn't just personally fulfilling, it was commercially viable. Janet had risked family relationships and industry connections to pursue her own creative path, and the result was the most successful album of her career to that point. Looking back, Control stands as one of the most important albums of the 1980s, not just because of its musical innovations, but because of what it represented culturally. Janet Jackson had used her platform to demonstrate that young women could reject the paths chosen for them by family and industry. That artistic authenticity was worth fighting for, even when the costs were high, and that true creative control required the courage to disappoint people who claimed to have your best interests at heart. The 19-year-old woman who walked into Flyte Tyme Studios carrying a lifetime of other people's expectations emerged 8 months later as an artist who had learned to trust her own creative instincts. Control wasn't just an album. It was a blueprint for artistic independence that would influence countless artists who came after Janet. She had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do is take control of your own story, even when everyone around you insists they know how that story should be told.